Screams echoed through the ash-choked streets of Pine Ridge. Just weeks ago, these same voices mocked the quiet man at the end of the cul-de-sac for his endless concrete deliveries. Now, freezing and starving, they battered against his reinforced steel door, begging for the one thing they couldn't buy: survival. Arthur Pendleton was not a man who wore tin-foil hats, nor did he stand on street corners holding signs about the end of the world. He was a 56-year-old retired civil engineer, a widower who kept his lawn immaculately mowed and paid his homeowners association dues on time. To the affluent residents of Oak Creek Estates, a sprawling, manicured subdivision in the foothills of the Pacific Northwest, Arthur was simply the eccentric, slightly boring neighbor at the end of Elmwood Drive. They didn't know about the $5 million he had quietly inherited from a forgotten uncle, nor did they understand why a single man living in a modest ranch-style house required so much heavy machinery. It started innocently enough. 3 years ago, Arthur submitted permits to the city for a foundation reinforcement and deep storage wine cellar. Because Oak Creek Estates was built on slightly uneven bedrock, the HOA approved it without much scrutiny. That was their first mistake. For 18 months, fleets of cement mixers rolled down the quiet suburban streets. Dump trucks hauled away thousands of cubic yards of earth. Greg Harrison, a hotshot corporate lawyer who lived directly across the street in a sprawling Tudor-style mansion, often stood on his porch with a scotch in hand, watching the construction with a smirk. "Building a tomb over there, Artie?" Greg shouted one evening over the roar of a backhoe. Arthur paused, wiping sweat from his brow, and offered a polite, practiced smile. "Just making sure the foundation outlasts us all, Greg. And I need a place with strict climate control for the Pinot." It was a lie. Meticulously crafted and perfectly delivered. Beneath Arthur's unremarkable single-story home lay a marvel of modern subterranean engineering. It wasn't a basement, it was a fortress, stretching nearly 3,000 square feet and plunging 30 feet into the dense bedrock. The shelter was encased in 3 feet of steel-reinforced, high-density concrete. Arthur had spent his career analyzing structural failures in government infrastructure. He knew exactly how fragile the modern grid was. He knew that society was only ever 3 missed meals away from total anarchy. When his wife, Martha, passed away during a severe winter storm because the region's power grid failed and her oxygen concentrator lost power, Arthur's grief crystallized into a singular, obsessive purpose. He would never be vulnerable to the system's failures again. The shelter was entirely self-sufficient. It featured a proprietary closed-loop geothermal heating and cooling system. He drilled a private artesian well deep into an underground aquifer, routing the water through a commercial-grade reverse osmosis and UV purification plant. His power grid was completely disconnected from the county lines, relying instead on a massive array of high-efficiency solar panels disguised as standard roofing tiles, feeding into a room entirely dedicated to military-grade lithium iron phosphate battery banks. For backup, he had a whisper-quiet diesel generator with a buried 10,000-gallon fuel tank. But Arthur's true masterpiece was the life support and sustainability sector. He installed NBC, nuclear, biological, chemical, air scrubbers with positive pressure valves to prevent any contaminated air from seeping in. A full third of the bunker was dedicated to a hydroponic garden illuminated by specialized LED grow lights, currently teeming with tomatoes, kale, potatoes, and medicinal herbs. Racks of freeze-dried food, vacuum-sealed grains, and medical supplies lined the walls of the storage wing, enough to keep 3 people comfortable for a decade. He built it for 3, though it was only him. Perhaps it was a lingering hope, or a ghost of the family he once dreamed of having. To the outside world, the construction eventually stopped. The lawn was resodded, the driveway repaved. The only visible anomaly was a heavy, oddly industrial steel door located in the back of his garage, which Arthur claimed led to the climate-controlled cellar. Life in Oak Creek Estates went on. Sarah Jenkins, the neighborhood gossip, and head of the HOA, hosted her lavish garden parties. Tom and Brenda Walsh paraded their new luxury SUVs up and down the street. They lived in a bubble of Wi-Fi, imported groceries, and climate-controlled comfort, blissfully unaware that beneath their feet, the tectonic plates of the Cascadia subduction zone were grinding toward a catastrophic breaking point. Arthur spent his evenings in the bunker, running diagnostics, rotating his stock, and reading. He was ready. He just didn't expect the catalyst to be as terrifying as it turned out to be. October 12th began like any other crisp, golden autumn morning. Greg Harrison was polishing his new electric sports car. Sarah Jenkins was jogging with her golden retriever. Arthur was in his backyard, pruning his rose bushes. At 10:14 a.m., the birds stopped singing. A profound, unnatural silence fell over the neighborhood, followed by a low, guttural vibration that seemed to emanate not from the ground, but from the marrow of their bones. Then, the earth violently tore itself apart. It wasn't just a localized earthquake, it was a 9.2 magnitude megathrust tremor. The asphalt of Elmwood Drive rippled like a liquid wave. Greg's pristine electric car was violently thrown on its side as a massive fissure opened in his driveway. Power lines whipped through the air, showering sparks before going dead. The facade of the Walsh's modern home collapsed inward, a cloud of drywall and shattered glass erupting into the street. The shaking lasted for a grueling, agonizing 6 minutes. When it finally stopped, the silence that followed was broken by the wailing of car alarms and the distant, terrifying roar of ruptured gas lines igniting in the city below. Arthur hadn't panicked. The moment the primary P waves hit, he had dropped his shears, walked calmly into his garage, and keyed the biometric lock on the heavy steel door. By the time the violent S waves ripped through the neighborhood, Arthur was already 20 feet underground, feeling only a gentle sway as his bunker's shock-absorbing hydraulic foundation went to work. Above ground, Oak Creek Estates was unrecognizable. But the earthquake was merely the opening act. The violent tectonic shift had triggered a massive, unpredicted awakening of a dormant volcanic fissure system 80 miles to the east. By late afternoon, the sky turned a bruised, sickening purple. The sun was blotted out entirely, replaced by a suffocating, dense rain of toxic, pulverized pumice and volcanic ash. The ash fall was apocalyptic. It coated everything in a heavy, grey sludge. It was highly abrasive and toxic, tearing at the lungs of anyone caught outside and clogging the intake valves of every engine and generator in the county. To make matters worse, the immense volume of particulate matter in the atmosphere triggered a localized nuclear winter effect. Temperatures plummeted from a comfortable 60 degrees to 14 degrees Fahrenheit in a matter of hours. Inside his bunker, Arthur watched the chaos unfold on his closed-circuit exterior cameras. He saw the panic. He watched as the cell towers went dead. The grid was completely obliterated. No emergency services were coming. The roads were impassable, choked by debris and 3 feet of heavy, freezing ash. For the first 3 days, the residents of Oak Creek clung to their upper-class illusions. They gathered in the street, wrapped in designer coats, holding useless smartphones. Greg Harrison took charge, assuring everyone that FEMA or the National Guard would arrive shortly. They barbecued thawed steaks from their failing freezers and huddled around decorative fire pits. But by day 4, the reality of their doom settled in like a physical weight. The water pipes had frozen and burst. The decorative wood was gone. The ash outside was still falling, making the air unbreathable without a mask. Hunger began to gnaw at them, stripping away their civilized veneers. By day 6, Sarah Jenkins' dog had died from inhaling the toxic ash. Tom Walsh broke his leg trying to scavenge for canned goods in a ruined grocery store 2 miles away, and infection was rapidly setting in. They were freezing to death in their multi-million-dollar mansions. On the evening of day 7, Greg Harrison sat in his freezing, dark living room, staring out the shattered window at the ruins of his neighborhood. His breath plumed in the freezing air. His stomach twisted with a hollow, agonizing ache. Across the street, Arthur Pendleton's modest ranch house stood eerily intact. A memory pierced through Greg's hypothermia-addled brain. He remembered the backhoe. He remembered the 18 months of cement trucks. He remembered the massive industrial crane lowering what looked like a bank vault door into Arthur's garage at 4 in the morning. Building a tomb over there, Artie? Just making sure the foundation outlasts us all. Greg's eyes widened in the darkness. It wasn't a wine cellar. Pendleton knew. The crazy bastard knew this was coming. And he had built a fortress. Greg stumbled to his feet, a manic, desperate energy flooding his frozen limbs. He grabbed a heavy iron fire poker and staggered out into the suffocating, ash-filled night. He didn't just walk to Arthur's house. He banged on the doors of the remaining neighbors. He dragged Sarah from her shivering stupor. He roused Brenda Walsh. "He has a bunker!" Greg screamed, his voice hoarse from the ash, his eyes wild with primal desperation. "Pendleton! Under his house. I saw the concrete. I saw the doors. He has heat. He has food. We have to get in." A mob of 10 freezing, starving, desperate suburbanites formed in the dead of night. The same people who had snubbed Arthur, who had gossiped about his drab clothes and quiet demeanor, now looked at his property as their only salvation. They trudged across the ash-choked lawn, coughing, shivering, their eyes fixed on the garage. Greg smashed a window with his iron poker and unlocked the side door. The group flooded into the garage. There, at the back of the space, mostly cleared of debris, stood the door. It was a massive slab of blast-resistant steel, painted a dull grey, completely flush with the reinforced concrete wall. There was no handle, only a biometric scanner glowing with a faint, mocking red light. Greg pounded his fists against the cold steel. The sound was flat, dead, absorbed by the sheer density of the metal. "Arthur!" Greg screamed, his voice cracking, spittle flying from his lips. "Arthur! Open the goddamn door! We know you're in there!" Silence. Sarah pushed forward, tears streaming down her soot-stained face. She slammed her open palms against the metal. "Arthur, please! It's Sarah! We're freezing out here! Tom is dying! You have to let us in, please. I'm begging you." Deep below the earth, bathed in the warm artificial sunlight of his hydroponic garden, Arthur sat at his command console. He held a steaming cup of freshly brewed coffee. On the high-definition monitor in front of him, he watched the night vision feed from the garage. He saw Greg swinging the iron poker against the blast door. He saw Sarah weeping on her knees. The heavy steel door didn't just block physical entry, it was soundproof. Arthur couldn't hear their screams, but as he watched their distorted, desperate faces on the monitor, he didn't need audio to know exactly what they were saying. He took a slow sip of his coffee. The external thermometer read 0 degrees. The ash was still falling. And for Arthur Pendleton, the hardest part of the apocalypse wasn't surviving the earth tearing itself apart. The hardest part was about to begin. Hours bled into a seemingly endless, freezing night. The mob in Arthur Pendleton's garage did not disperse. They couldn't, stepping back outside into the abrasive, choking ash. And the single-digit temperatures meant certain death. Greg Harrison, stripped entirely of his corporate bravado, had descended into a frantic state of obsessive destruction. He scoured Arthur's garage and found a heavy-duty Makita angle grinder and a box of diamond-tipped masonry blades. For over 2 hours, the screeching of metal on metal echoed through the concrete space as Greg attacked the hinges of the blast door. Showers of sparks illuminated the terrified faces of the neighbors huddled in the corners. Sarah Jenkins rocked back and forth, muttering incoherent prayers. Brenda Walsh held her husband, Tom, whose shattered leg was now severely swollen, the skin stretched tight and radiating a dangerous, feverish heat. Below them, Arthur sat perfectly still in his ergonomically designed command chair. The bunker was dead silent, insulated entirely from the horrific noise above. On his primary monitor, the thermal imaging cameras showed the exact heat signatures of the 10 people in his garage. Arthur's eyes drifted to the reinforced bookshelf to his left. specifically resting on a worn copy of Strategic Relocation by Joel Skousen, a real-life architectural expert in hardened, secure residences whose blueprints Arthur had meticulously adapted for his own shelter. Skousen had warned about the Golden Horde, the desperate masses fleeing the cities when the supply chain collapsed. Arthur had prepared for strangers. He hadn't fully prepared for the psychological weight of watching the people he had lived next to for a decade slowly die on his doorstep. On the screen, Greg threw the angle grinder across the garage. The blade had filed down to a nub, barely scratching the surface of the half-inch AR-500 steel plating. The door was designed to withstand a direct blast from C4 explosive. A power tool bought from a local hardware store was nothing more than a minor annoyance. Greg collapsed against the cold steel, sliding down until he was sitting on the floor, weeping. The sight of the ruthless attorney broken and crying triggered a strange flutter in Arthur's chest. It wasn't triumph. It was a profound, hollow sadness. Arthur reached forward and pressed the red toggle switch that activated the exterior two-way intercom system. A sharp burst of static crackled from the heavy speakers mounted in the corners of the garage. The neighbors gasped, their heads snapping toward the ceiling. Greg scrambled to his feet, wiping soot and tears from his face. "Arthur!" Greg yelled, his voice echoing. "Arthur! You son of a bitch! I know you're there!" "I am here, Greg." Arthur's voice boomed through the speakers. It was calm, measured, and entirely devoid of panic. The contrast between his composed tone and the shivering, frantic crowd was jarring. "Open the door!" Sarah screamed, running up to the camera lens she spotted above the frame. "Arthur, please! Tom is dying! The ash is in our lungs. We don't have water. You have to save us." "I cannot open the door, Sarah," Arthur replied. "The airlock protocols require a full positive pressure purge. If I open that door, the volcanic silica will compromise the NBC scrubbers. If the scrubbers fail, I suffocate." "You're lying!" Greg roared, slamming his fist into the steel. "You have room. You have supplies. I've seen the invoices, Pendleton. I know you have a hydroponic bay. I know you have a medical wing. You're just a selfish, paranoid sociopath playing God." Arthur took a slow breath. This shelter was engineered with a strict mathematical carrying capacity. The oxygen generation, the caloric output of the garden, the water filtration cycle, it is balanced. It is a closed system. Introducing 10 unvetted, untrained, and emotionally compromised individuals into this environment will destroy that equilibrium. You would exhaust the medical supplies in a week. You would panic. You would turn on each other. And then we would all die. "We will follow your rules," Brenda pleaded, her voice cracking. "Just take Tom. Just take my husband. He needs antibiotics. You can leave me out here, Arthur. Please. Just save him." Arthur's finger hovered over the intercom button. He looked at Brenda. He remembered when Martha had fallen ill, the desperate, helpless feeling of watching someone you love fade away because the resources simply weren't available. He had built this place to 3-person specifications. He could take 2 people. Before Arthur could reply, the motion sensors on the perimeter fence chimed. A new set of thermal signatures appeared on Arthur's secondary screen. A heavily modified diesel pickup truck, equipped with a makeshift snowplow, smashed through the wooden gates of Arthur's driveway. The truck skidded to a halt in the ash. 5 men piled out. They weren't suburbanites. They wore heavy surplus tactical gear, their faces covered by dual cartridge respirators, and they were heavily armed. Arthur zoomed the camera in. The leader, a massive man carrying a pump-action shotgun and a heavy crowbar, gestured toward the open side door of the garage. They had seen the broken window. They had seen the sparks from Greg's angle grinder. "Greg," Arthur's voice snapped through the intercom, losing its calm cadence for the first time. "Get away from the door. Now. Not until you open it," Greg shouted back. "Look behind you, you fool," Arthur commanded. Greg turned just as the 5 armed scavengers stormed into the garage. The neighbors screamed, scrambling backward, pressing themselves against the concrete walls. The scavengers raised their weapons, the tactical flashlights mounted on their barrels, blinding the exhausted residents of Oak Creek Estates. The leader pulled down his respirator, revealing a scarred, soot-stained face. He looked at the shivering suburbanites in their ruined designer clothes, and then his eyes locked onto the massive grey blast door. A slow, terrifying smile spread across his face. "Well, well," the scavenger growled. "Looks like we found the jackpot." Tension in the garage thickened into a suffocating, palpable dread. The scavengers didn't care about the neighbors. They recognized the steel door for what it was, a vault protecting resources that were now infinitely more valuable than gold. "Who's inside?" the leader demanded, leveling his shotgun directly at Greg's chest. Greg raised his hands, his eyes darting frantically between the weapon and the heavy steel door behind him. The survival instinct that had driven him to tear apart his own neighborhood twisted into something much darker. A desperate, sickening negotiation formed in his mind. "His name is Arthur," Greg stammered, stepping away from his neighbors. "He's an engineer. He's in there alone. He's got everything. Power, food, guns, medicine. A whole underground complex," Sarah gasped. "Greg, what are you doing?" "Shut up, Sarah," Greg snapped, then turned back to the scavenger. "Listen to me. I know the layout of his house. I know where the air intake vents are buried in the yard. If you try to cut through this door, it'll take you weeks. But if you block his vents, you can smoke him out. I can show you exactly where they are. Deep underground." Arthur watched the betrayal unfold in high definition. He felt a cold, hard knot form in his stomach. Greg was willing to execute Arthur to buy his own life. The tragedy was that Greg's plan would actually work. While Arthur had secondary concealed intakes, a coordinated attack on the primary vents would severely compromise the system and force a manual override. "You show us the vents," the scavenger leader said, lowering the shotgun slightly, "and maybe we let you keep some of the scraps when we breach it." "Deal," Greg said, without hesitation. Arthur exhaled. The ghost of his late wife, Martha, seemed to whisper in the quiet hum of the bunker's ventilation. "You can't save the world, Artie, but you can't lose your humanity either." He had built the bunker to survive the apocalypse, but if he allowed men like Greg and these scavengers to inherit the earth above, what was the point of surviving at all? Arthur reached up to the master control panel. He flipped a covered toggle switch marked external deterrence. "Greg," Arthur's voice echoed through the garage speakers, freezing everyone in their tracks. "You always were a terrible neighbor." Arthur slammed his fist onto the execution button. 4 concealed high-pressure nozzles dropped from the ceiling of the garage. With a deafening hiss, they unleashed a thick, blinding cloud of military-grade CS tear gas directly into the enclosed space. Instantly, the garage descended into pure, agonizing chaos. The scavengers, having taken off their masks to speak, caught the full brunt of the chemical agent. They dropped their weapons, screaming, clawing blindly at their burning eyes and throats. The leader fired his shotgun blindly into the ceiling before collapsing to his knees, retching violently. Greg, Sarah, Brenda, and the others were engulfed. They scrambled blindly, choking and gagging in the suffocating white smoke. Arthur watched the thermal cameras. The heat signatures were scattering, stumbling toward the broken window and the open side door, desperate for oxygen, even if it was the ash-choked air of the apocalypse. He had to move fast. The gas would clear in minutes, and the scavengers would return, enraged and lethal. Arthur initiated the airlock sequence. The massive steel door hissed, hydraulic seals releasing with a heavy mechanical thud. The door swung outward. Behind it was a 10 by 10-foot decontamination chamber, brightly lit by sterile fluorescent tubes. Another identical steel door stood at the back of the chamber. Arthur stood in the airlock, wearing a full-face respirator and holding a 1-2 gauge shotgun loaded with rubber buckshot. "Brenda!" Arthur shouted, his voice muffled through his mask. "Brenda!" Drag Tom to the light. Now! Through the swirling, stinging white gas, Brenda saw the square of bright light. Adrenaline, fueled by pure maternal and spousal desperation, surged through her freezing body. She grabbed her husband by the collar of his ruined coat and pulled with all her might. Tom groaned in agony as his broken leg dragged across the concrete, but they moved. They breached the threshold, collapsing onto the metal grating of the airlock floor. Tom was barely conscious, his breathing shallow and ragged. Brenda coughed violently, tears streaming down her red, inflamed face. Suddenly, a shadow lunged through the dissipating smoke. Greg Harrison, his eyes bloodshot and streaming with tears, hurled himself toward the open door. "No! You're not leaving me out here. You're taking me." He slammed into Arthur, knocking the older man back a step. Greg's hands clawed frantically at Arthur's mask, desperate to rip it off, desperate to force his way into the sanctuary. Arthur didn't hesitate. He didn't fire the weapon. Instead, he drove the heavy wooden stock of the shotgun hard into Greg's sternum. The air was driven from Greg's lungs in a sharp gasp. He stumbled backward, his foot catching the raised lip of the blast door frame. Greg tumbled backward, crashing hard onto the concrete floor of the garage, right next to the convulsing scavenger leader. Arthur slammed his hand against the red emergency close button on the wall. "Arthur, no! Arthur!" Greg screamed, crawling forward, his hands reaching out. The heavy steel door swung shut. The hydraulic bolts engaged with a series of heavy, final clunks. The screaming from the garage was instantly silenced, cut off as if it had never existed. Arthur stood in the airlock, his chest heaving, the shotgun trembling slightly in his grip. He looked down. Brenda was weeping openly, clinging to Tom's motionless body. The sterile white light of the chamber illuminated the soot, the blood, and the absolute despair of the world they had just left behind. "Strip off your clothes," Arthur commanded, his voice cold, projecting through the respirator. "Leave them in the biohazard bin. The chemical shower will activate in 10 seconds. When it turns off, open the red locker. Put on the scrubs inside." Brenda looked up at him, her eyes wide, with a mixture of terror and overwhelming gratitude. Thank you. Don't thank me yet," Arthur said, turning away to prep the medical wing for the trauma patient he had just acquired. He had saved 2 lives. He had condemned 8 others to freeze or be murdered by scavengers. The calculus of survival was complete, but as Arthur walked through the inner blast door and heard it lock behind him, he knew the truth. The apocalypse wasn't the earthquake. It wasn't the ash blocking out the sun. The apocalypse was the realization of what a man was willing to do and who he was willing to sacrifice, just to keep breathing for one more day in a concrete box beneath the ruins of the world. Survival isn't just about the concrete you pour or the supplies you stockpile. It's the unbearable weight of deciding who gets to live when the world ends. Arthur built a fortress, but locked himself in a prison of his own morality. If this intense survival drama kept you on edge, please like this video, share it with a friend, and subscribe for more thrilling apocalyptic stories.